So we've got a major new development in the nationwide legal fight to dismantle the NFA after the $0 tax change. Up to this point, the DOJ has been trying to defend the NFA by arguing that the system still functions properly and that it operates like a permissible regulatory scheme. The plaintiffs have already been pushing back on that very issue, showing some very real-world evidence that the ATF is exercising discretion in not running anything close to a neutral shall-issue system. But now things have developed even more because they just introduced a new ruling out of the Fifth Circuit that directly attacks the core constitutional foundation that the government has been relying on and using to defend the NFA. And if this reasoning holds up, it doesn't just weaken the NFA, it potentially could collapse the entire structure and rationale that the DOJ and the ATF have been using to support the NFA. So let's break down what just happened. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, this case is part of the broader wave of challenges that kind of followed after Congress reduced the NFA tax to $0 for certain items like SBRs, suppressors, AOWs, short-barreled shotguns, and other items under the NFA. This all came after the One Big Beautiful bill was passed, and again, it reduced the NFA tax for those items from $200 to $0. Now, historically, that tax was the entire constitutional foundation for the NFA. The NFA was upheld because it was framed as an actual tax. But now that that tax has effectively been reduced to $0, the plaintiffs argue that this law no longer functions as a tax at all and therefore must be struck down. They argue that what currently remains with the NFA is a system that simply has registration, restrictions, and criminal penalties that essentially is a standalone regulatory scheme not tied to a tax at all. Right now, in this case, both sides are trying to win essentially at the motion for summary judgment stage, so they want to resolve this without going to a full trial. The DOJ is still arguing that the NFA should survive, that it's a permissible scheme. The plaintiffs say that this system has lost its constitutional foundation and therefore should be struck down entirely. And recently, the plaintiffs have been aggressively strengthening that argument by bringing in new authority. And here's what we just got in this case, which is a big update. The plaintiffs have filed a new supplemental notice pointing to a new decision that just came out of the Fifth Circuit in a case called McNutt versus DOJ. And this dealt with, I believe, home brewing of alcohol and the federal restrictions surrounding some of that issue. This decision is coming directly out of the Fifth Circuit, which means that it's binding precedent on this court reviewing the NFA challenge. This new case directly addresses the limits of Congress's taxing powers. And in this case, the Fifth Circuit looked at a federal law that banned in-home distilling of alcohol. And the government tried to justify that law under the same theory that we see, currently being put forward in this NFA challenge. They argue that this law is tied to Congress's taxing powers, but the Fifth Circuit rejected that argument. They ruled that if a law does not actually generate revenue, it cannot be justified as a tax. And even more importantly, they found that you can't use the necessary and proper clause to save it if it's not actually tied to a tax either. Now, the plaintiffs are taking that reasoning and applying it directly to this NFA challenge. And their argument is very straightforward. If the NFA was upheld as a tax prior, and now the tax is effectively gone because it's zero, then the law is no longer functioning as a tax at all. And under this new Fifth Circuit ruling, that's a constitutional problem. Because as the Fifth Circuit just made clear in this new ruling, the essential feature of any tax is that it produces actual revenue. If it doesn't, it loses its constitutional justification and therefore is unconstitutional. Now, the plaintiffs did not just stop here with this ruling. They also pointed to this ruling in another key part of what the Fifth Circuit said in that decision. The court warned there that if the government's theory were accepted, it would create unlimited federal powers, and that is an issue because Congress could regulate virtually anything by tying it loosely to a taxation. And the court rejected that here in that Fifth Circuit ruling. They said that the Constitution must have a limiting principle. Now, bringing that back to this NFA case, that is a very similar argument that was made by the DOJ in this case, which the plaintiffs are currently pushing back on. The plaintiffs in this NFA case are saying that if the government can require registration, fingerprinting, and federal approval for firearms based on a tax that doesn't actually function as a tax, then there is no limiting principle, and that's exactly what the Fifth Circuit just said was unconstitutional. So that was one big aspect of that Fifth Circuit ruling that's now being used in this NFA case, but there is also another piece that's being brought in. The plaintiffs also used that case to go after another major argument made by the DOJ in this NFA challenge, and that is them trying to rely on the Commerce Clause. The Fifth Circuit in this new ruling emphasized that you can't just invent a new constitutional basis after the fact. You must look at what power the law was actually based on when it was first passed. And the plaintiffs argue that the NFA was not built on the Commerce Clause at all, but instead its whole premise was built on the actual taxing powers of Congress. So the government can't just make a switch now. They can't just pull in a new theory to justify and save the NFA, because the whole premise originally was the taxing power. And now that that's gone, they can't just say, well, Commerce Clause saves this law. So stepping back, this is a major escalation in this case. Before, the plaintiffs were arguing that the NFA doesn't function like a real tax anymore, and now they have an actual binding decision out of the Fifth Circuit dealing with a very similar issue, very similar arguments and premises that is now supporting their position in this NFA lawsuit. So now here's what we're looking at in this case. You have the $0 tax passed by Congress, a regulatory system still being enforced, claiming that it's using taxing powers still in other types of authorities like necessary and proper and Commerce Clause. And now you have a new decision out of the Fifth Circuit dealing with those very issues, saying that laws without revenue cannot be justified as taxes. The plaintiffs are arguing that the NFA challenge here fits exactly with that problem that was just addressed by the Fifth Circuit, and that's why this district court needs to look at what the Fifth Circuit said in that issue. It's binding precedent on the Fifth Circuit. It's binding precedent on this district court here reviewing the NFA, dealing with very similar issues, and they're saying you need to follow what the Fifth Circuit said and apply this against the NFA. So this new supplemental filing is a big deal because it doesn't just add another argument to this case. It actually adds binding appellate authority out of the Fifth Circuit that directly supports the plaintiff's position against the current NFA structure. And if the court accepts that reasoning, it could fundamentally change how the NFA is viewed in this case and how it's addressed and how it's kind of reviewed under the Constitution. So that's the latest update in this nationwide NFA challenge based on the $0 tax change that was passed. As soon as we get more information, as soon as the court responds, and as soon as the DOJ responds to this new authority that's been submitted, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by liking, commenting, and subscribing. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.